What's up, everyone? Today we finish up Romans chapter 11. And really these first 5 weeks of our study looking at Romans 9 through 11 all goes together. These chapters have been discussing Israel's role in God's salvation plan, and today is the climax of that discussion. Let's break it down verse by verse. Verse 25, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. These 3 verses focus on the mystery of Israel's hardening or their rejection of Jesus as Messiah. Paul sees Israel's current unbelief as a temporary state, part of a divine mystery. The partial hardening of Israel is not permanent, but will last until the full number of Gentiles comes in. This phrase reflects God's plan to incorporate the nations into his covenant family before bringing about Israel's eventual restoration. Now, the first part of verse 26, saying all Israel will be saved, is somewhat controversial. There are different takes on exactly how that will happen. Does it mean all Jews who have ever lived will be saved? Is it all Jews who have believed in Jesus? Or perhaps it's all Jews who are alive at the final time of salvation. I don't know if anyone knows for sure, but we can be certain that Israel's situation isn't permanent or some kind of lost hope. It's all part of God's amazing strategy to bring in the Gentiles. And when that plan is complete, Israel will experience a renewal. Paul then, in verses 26 and 27, reinforces this point by quoting a couple of prophecies from Isaiah and Jeremiah. These remind us that God is committed to eliminating ungodliness from Israel and honoring his covenant promises. It's like a divine reassurance that God's not done with Israel yet. Let's keep moving. Verse 28, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Here, Paul tackles a crucial point. Despite Israel's current position, God's gifts and call are unchangeable. Their unbelief doesn't mean God has withdrawn his promises. No, he remembers their forefathers. He remembers the faith that Abraham had when he called him to a distant land. He remembers that Moses and the faith that Moses had to part the Red Sea, leading Israel's salvation from Egypt. God will never forget his history with Israel. It's as if they are a long-lost son that God the Father is waiting to return home, which leads so beautifully into the next section on God's mercy. And I briefly, before I get to mercy, want to mention last week that Israel had played the role of the older brother in the prodigal son story. However, after the inclusion of the Gentiles into God's family, the brother's role can be reversed. Israel can now be seen as the prodigal who the father is awaiting to return home. And us Gentiles should learn a lesson from the older brother, not being bitter when the prodigal returns, but rather joining in the celebration. We should celebrate because each group is the same in requiring the mercy of God. And his mercy can be viewed as a vast ocean encompassing everyone, both Jews and Gentiles. Gentiles, once disobedient, are now recipients of God's mercy. And the exciting part, the same mercy is ready now to fully engulf Israel too. This isn't just a theological twist, it's God's orchestration of grace. It's as if everybody gets a seat at the table of God's kindness, showing how cleverly inclusive God's plan truly is. Now, let's turn to the final section of Romans 11, which is a doxology of praise to God. Verse 33. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. how unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways. Inscrutable is a funny word, but the ESV, I don't know, puts it that way. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. This is the pinnacle of Paul's long discourse on the gospel and how it has been worked into Jews and Gentiles alike. Paul is so moved by God's profound wisdom and knowledge that he can't help but burst into praise. He's basically saying, God, your ways are way beyond our understanding. And this is a pivotal reminder to us that God's greatness far surpasses our own understanding, and that should lead us to humility. It's about trusting God's mysterious yet perfect plans. Paul's words here are a poetic declaration affirming that all things originate from God, operate through his power, and ultimately return to him. It's a declaration of God's sovereignty and purpose throughout all creation. For from him and through him and to him are all things. He deserves all of the glory. I also love personally how all of Paul's knowledge and his position as this instrumental leader in the early church, writing most of the New Testament, this never kept him from simply bursting out in praise to God. His knowledge did not pump him up and, make him be prideful, but rather it brought him to his knees in honor of the God who he was gaining knowledge and insight about. And may that always be our reaction to increasing our own knowledge of God as well. So what are we taking away from Romans 11:25-36? Here are a few key points. Number one, the inclusion of the Gentiles is part of a larger plan that ultimately leads to Israel's restoration. Now, how exactly this happens, we don't necessarily know, but all of Israel will be saved. I will say I don't think it makes sense for this to happen outside of what Paul has already defined as a requirement for joining God's family, that one must confess with their mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in their heart that God raised him from the dead. Number two, God's promises are unchangeable. This comes directly from verse 29. His method of how the promises are fulfilled might change, but he is always true to his word. And then number three, our response to God's plan and mercy should be praise, as Paul demonstrates in his doxology. Well, friends, we made it. That is all for Romans 9-11. The rest of Romans will not be near as theological, but rather much more practical, teaching us how to walk out this incredible gospel that Paul has presented. Hope you're excited for that. I'll see you next time for chapter 12. I hope you have a great week.